Welcome back. We're on the brain, stress, and the weird power of language today. And this episode gets properly wild because it goes from habits to trauma to aging to manifestation. The first thing that jumped out at me was that awareness is already half the battle, which is annoying because it means you can't just vibe your way out of your own patterns. Right. The brain does not care about your inspirational quote collection. It starts with spotting the pattern, then actually looking at the consequence. That part felt brutal because it's not about wishing harder. It's about admitting, oh, this thing keeps costing me something. And then the brain wants repetition, not drama. Which is so unromantic, honestly. But that's also where the hope is, because repetition means change is possible. The whole three-step thing was interesting, but the accountability piece made it real for me. Because left alone, most people will quit when it gets uncomfortable. Which is basically every New Year's resolution ever. Exactly, the gym gets a surprise visit in January and then vanishes. But the part about trauma being soft-wired instead of hard-wired was huge. That changes the whole emotional temperature of the conversation. It means some patterns are deep but not frozen forever. And she did not pretend every wound is easy to fix, which I respected. Because some people really do carry consequences for life. But even then, the idea is still that something can be done. That's the difference between despair and agency. The generational trauma and epigenetics part was another one that got me. I still can't get over the idea that stress can affect gene expression. Not the DNA itself, but which parts get switched on and off. And the fact that pregnancy stress can literally shape the child's stress response is intense. Also impossible not to feel the weight of that as a parent. But she kept making the point that this is not blame, it's awareness. That distinction matters a lot. Then grief came up and that got very real very fast. I liked that she didn't try to make grief neat or productive. She basically said you have to go through it, not around it. Which is hard because we're all so good at avoidance. We can turn avoidance into a full-time profession. But if the emotion isn't processed, it comes back later anyway. That felt like one of the most honest parts of the whole thing. And then she pivoted into neuroplasticity mechanisms like it was nothing. Myelination, synaptics connection, neurogenesis, all in one breath. She was absolutely not here to be casual about it. But the point was actually simple. Repeated behavior builds stronger pathways. And exercise, sleep, hydration, and stress regulation create the conditions for that. Which is annoying again because it means there's no hack. There's just boring consistency dressed up as wisdom. I was especially interested in the language piece, though. Words really do seem to prime behavior more than people want to admit. Even the word need sounded like a tiny trap to her. And honestly, she's right, because language can make life feel compulsory. I don't have time versus this isn't my priority is a huge shift. One takes away your power, the other gives it back. The brain is basically listening to your excuses like a lawyer. It is, and it will absolutely use them against you later. The manifestation part was probably the most controversial, but also the most grounded. Because she didn't really mean magic, she meant brain plus action. Thought, belief, behavior, then reality changes. And I loved that she renamed vision boards as action boards. That feels way more honest because you still have to do the work. The universe is not your unpaid intern. Thank you, that is exactly the line. The relationship section was also sneaky powerful. Wanting a great partner is useless if you're not that person yourself. That's a painful mirror for a lot of people. And also for every guy who says he wants a queen while living like a goblin. That was extremely specific, Malik. I contain multitudes, and one of them is judgment. But the deeper point is that you rise to your values and fall to your wounds. That line stayed with me. And it also connects back to self-worth because you keep choosing from that level. Then there was the neurodivergence discussion, which opened everything back up. Better diagnosis explains part of the rise, but so does a changing world. More technology, more stimulation, more pressure, less slack in the system. It makes sense that some brains would struggle differently now. And then she dropped humming and chanting like ancient people had the cheat code. Imagine discovering your nervous system just wanted a good hum. But honestly, the body loves simple regulation more than we think. And the aging experiment was one of the best examples of that. Those people literally got younger in posture and movement after living like they were younger. which is unbelievable until you remember the brain is always interpreting identity. If you tell yourself you're old, limited, or broken, your body starts obeying, which is deeply rude but apparently true. Deeply rude is the slogan of neuroscience today. I also liked her honesty about changing her own language around the word need. That's the kind of tiny self-edit that actually changes behavior over time. Same with choosing gratitude and visualization as a starting point. Not because it fixes everything, but because it moves you out of fear. And that fear to trust shift is where momentum begins. So if we're wrapping the whole series, that's probably the biggest idea. You are not finished, and your brain is not fixed. You can train it, shape it, and even surprise yourself with it. And apparently, you can do a lot of that by paying attention to sleep and beans. Very glamorous biohacking, very elite stuff. Final thought from me is that this whole conversation makes responsibility feel bigger, not heavier. Bigger, because now you see what your choices can actually shape. And that is kind of empowering if you let it be. That's episode 2, that's the series, and I feel like my brain got a software update. Same, and I'm now suspicious of my own sentence structure. If this episode did one thing, I hope it made people feel less stuck. And a little more responsible for what happens next. We'll leave it there, and we'll catch you in the next one. Welcome back. This one is all about neuroplasticity, stress, and rewriting the brain. And honestly, the wild part is how physical all of this gets. Like thoughts are not just thoughts here, they become habits, health, even identity. That is a terrifying amount of power for one inner voice to have. The first thing that hit me was how much awareness matters. Not changing anything yet, just spotting the pattern. Which is rude because I was hoping for a shortcut. Same, I wanted a brain download and a six-pack of discipline. But the point is, if you cannot see the pattern, you cannot break it. That is such an annoying truth. And then you go below the behavior into the belief, which is the real knife twist. Because the person is not just choosing badly, they may be protecting a wound. That is where the whole conversation got deeper for me. The trauma part too, because people hear soft wiring and think it is some nice motivational phrase. But it is actually saying, yes, some pathways are very established, just not forever. So the brain is stubborn, not sealed in cement. That is a much kinder way to insult ourselves. I like the part about chronic stress too, because it connects the mind and body in a brutal way. Cortisol, inflammation, belly fat, heart disease, that is not abstract at all. People still act like stress is just a mood. No, it is a whole body event. And the weird part is how stress spreads socially too. Emotional contagion, body language, tone, the room you are in. So your environment can absolutely sabotage your nervous system. Which means some workplaces are basically group anxiety factories. That is not a workplace, that is a cortisol subscription. The pregnancy piece was heavy too because it makes stress feel intergenerational in a real way. Not blame, just awareness of what can get passed through the system. And that was handled carefully, which I appreciated. Then the grief conversation took it somewhere else completely. That idea of going to the bottom of the hole is intense. But I get it, because avoidance just delays the bill. Eventually, the emotions come back with interest. And grief is not something you can outthink. You have to process it, not perform around it. That distinction mattered a lot to me. Then we got into neuroplasticity itself, which is where it gets fun again. Myelin, synapses, neurogenesis, this is the brain building roads in real time. Your brain is basically an overworked city planner, and repetition is what makes the route faster. So the thing you keep doing becomes the thing you become better at, which is great if the habit is good and horrifying if it is not. Incredible system, terrible user interface. That is exactly it. The exercise part surprised me more than I expected. Aerobic movement helps neurogenesis, sleep helps, hydration helps, all of it stacks. But weights alone do not do the same thing in that specific way. So my ego at the gym is not the whole wellness strategy. Sad news for every man who thinks one heavy lift solves a life. The visualization study was mad, though. People imagined lifting and still gained muscle. The brain really said, fine, I will do some of the work. But not all of it, because apparently reality still exists. And that connects so well to manifestation, because the version here is not magic. It is thoughts, beliefs, actions, and repeated behavior. Not just staring at a vision board and waiting for the universe to text back. That taxi cab argument in New York is hilarious because it captures the whole misunderstanding. If you want the life, you still have to become the person who can hold it. That is why the relationship example landed so hard. You do not just list what you want in someone, you check what you bring. Otherwise, you are out here demanding excellence with no inventory. Minimum effort, maximum standards, the modern disease. But the deeper line was that we meet people at the level of our wounds and our values. That one hurts because it is so clean. And then the language piece just kept proving itself over and over. The words you use to describe yourself are not harmless background noise. Saying you need coffee, saying you are messy, saying you have no time, it all adds up. We really do narrate our own prison sometimes. That is bleak but accurate. The age-priming studies were one of my favorite parts too. Those octogenarians basically got younger by living younger for a week. Posture, coordination, even how they were rated in photos changed. That is insane evidence for how expectation shapes the body. Even the Florida Words Room study is so simple and so brutal. Sunshine, beach, retirement, and suddenly everyone is walking like they need a pension. Language is clearly not decorative, it is operational. Which is why the last takeaway was so strong. Be clear about what you want. Visualize it, feel gratitude, move from fear to trust. That is not fluff when you hear it in this framework. It becomes a way of training attention and identity. And honestly, that is the whole series for me. Less stuck, more responsible, but also more hopeful. Also a little more paranoid about every sentence I say. Which may actually be a good thing in moderation. Thanks for being here for the whole ride with us. If this series gave you even one useful mental reframe, that is the win. We will see you in the next one, and until then, mind the words you keep repeating. Welcome back. This episode is all about neuroplasticity, stress, and why your brain is not fixed. We get into habits, trauma, sleep, and the weird power of what you keep telling yourself. And honestly, some of this sounds like self-help until the brain science punches you in the face. Like, wait, my words are actually programming my behavior? That is the uncomfortable part because it means you are participating in your own wiring. Okay, but people hear that and instantly think fake positivity nonsense. Right, because staring into a mirror and yelling rich, hot, and unstoppable is apparently science. That is exactly the part people are allergic to. The better version is closer to reality, like saying I am safe, I can do this, I am learning. That feels less delusional and more like emotional engineering. Yes, and it connects to the whole idea of focused repetition building new pathways. First you notice the pattern, then you see the consequences, then you practice a different response. Which is annoyingly sensible. Nobody wants the answer to be that boring, but it works. What I loved is how she kept bringing it back to awareness before action. Because if you do not notice the trigger, you keep calling it personality. And then you defend your chaos like it is your brand. That one hurt a little too much. The trauma part gets even more serious because some patterns are inherited, not invented. The generational trauma and epigenetics bit was wild. Not in a spooky way, but in a wow, your body remembers more than your opinions way. And that does not mean blame your parents for everything. It means stop pretending your environment has no impact. The distinction between genotype and phenotype was the key for me. Your DNA is not the whole story because expression changes with stress and context. Which is strangely hopeful because if expression changes, then so can the outcome. That pregnancy part landed hard too. Stress hormones can cross over, and that means the body is always having a conversation. A very inconvenient conversation, honestly. Like the body just refuses to be left out of the group chat. But she was careful not to turn that into guilt, which I appreciated. Because nobody needs another reason to feel like a bad parent. The grief section was probably the deepest part of the whole thing. She was basically saying you cannot skim grief and call it healing. You have to go all the way down into it. Which is such an ugly truth because everyone wants the shortcut. But avoidance becomes delayed pain with interest. That is the most expensive savings account ever. Delayed pain with interest is brutal. And then she linked that to emotional contagion, which is so real. Your stress does not stay private if you are constantly around other stressed people. That workplace piece is huge because high-pressure environments can become identity factories. Totally. And then people call it ambition when it is sometimes just chronic cortisol. That is the most corporate sentence I have heard all week. She kept hammering the basics, too, which is probably why it works. Sleep, movement, hydration, food, all the unsexy stuff. Humanity really hates homework when the homework is water and bedtime. And yet that is where the brain stuff starts paying rent. The exercise section was fascinating, especially the difference between aerobic work and weight training for neurogenesis. And the fact that visualization can influence outcomes is bananas. Not magic, but still bananas. It is bananas because the brain responds to repeated imagined action almost like rehearsal. So my future self can get a gym membership from the sofa. If only my sofa was that productive. The dark-skinned foods thing was another one that felt very practical. More antioxidants, more plant diversity, better support for brain health. Blueberries, black beans, purple broccoli, dark chocolate, all the good stuff. It sounds like a goth grocery list, but I respect it. Then there was the aging experiment, which I thought was brilliant. Just changing the environment and identity cues made people function younger. Their posture improved, their movement improved, even how people rated them changed. That means age is not just biology, it is also expectation. Which is annoying because expectations are basically invisible weights. Invisible weights is such a good phrase. And then the whole language piece tied it all together. Need versus want, can versus cannot, I am versus I feel. Even tiny language choices can change whether you feel trapped or agentic. I hated how much sense that made. Same, because now I have to listen to myself talk all day. But that is the gift too, because if language shapes attention, then responsibility becomes a tool. That is why the manifestation conversation landed better than expected. It is not wishing, it is aligning thought, belief, and action. And the relationship example was so clean. You cannot demand qualities in others you are not willing to cultivate yourself. That part stings because it is true. It turns dating into a mirror instead of a marketplace. That line about rising to your values or falling to your wounds was the sharpest thing in the episode. That is an actual punchline from the universe. And it applies to work too, not just love. Because if you focus only on what you want, you become needy. If you focus on what you offer, you become useful, generous, and attractive. Brutal but elegant. So the big takeaway is not that the brain can do anything instantly. It is that change is possible if you build the conditions for it. That feels more humane to me than fake optimism. Exactly, because hope without behavior is just decoration. Expensive decoration, usually in a vision board font. Okay, that is evil. If we wrap this whole series in one idea, it is that your brain is trainable and your life is participatory. And that is probably the most empowering thing we could leave you with. Be honest about your patterns, be patient with your wounds, and keep practicing the next right response. Thank you for staying with us through both episodes and all the rabbit holes. We went everywhere, but I think we found the point. If this series gave you one useful reframe, that is the win. Go back, listen again, and maybe catch the sentence your brain needed most. We will see you in the next one. Welcome back, because this one goes deep into rewriting the brain and stress resilience. We are talking patterns, cortisol, trauma, and why your body keeps receipts. And somehow it all circles back to sleep, movement, and what you keep saying to yourself. The part that got me was how awareness is basically step one in half the battle. Because people always want the magic trick, not the boring mirror. Exactly. They want a brain upgrade without the awkward self-honesty. Neuroplasticity sounds futuristic, but the real game is repetition and attention. And then she makes it painfully practical with habits, triggers, and consequences. Which is rude because that means the problem is often us. Not always us, but yes, annoyingly often us. What I loved is that she did not treat the brain like a fixed object. She kept saying soft wiring, not hard wiring, and that changes the whole mood. It makes you feel less trapped, especially when the conversation moves into trauma and inherited stress. The idea that stress can echo through generations is wild. Not in a mystical way, but through biology, pregnancy, and environment. That part is heavy because it is not blame, it is awareness. Which is probably why people either dismiss it or get defensive. Humans love a concept right up until it asks them to change. That is the entire self-help industry, basically. The cortisol piece mattered too because chronic stress is not just feelings in the air. It becomes inflammation, fatigue, belly fat, and long-term disease risk. We keep treating stress like a personality issue when it is a physical one. And the workplace angle is brutal because high-pressure cultures normalize damage. People wear burnout like a badge until their body refuses to cooperate. Then suddenly sleep matters, food matters, water matters, and everyone acts surprised. Like the brain was built on vibes and not chemistry. The sleep section was strong too because she tied rhythm to resilience. Regular sleep, movement, hydration, and emotional regulation are not extras. They are the operating system. And then there is the whole manifestation conversation, which could have gone completely off the rails. It almost did, but she grounded it in action rather than wishful thinking. That was the important distinction, because thought alone is not the full story. She basically said your thoughts matter because they shape your choices. And choices shape outcomes, which is a much less sexy but much stronger claim. The universe is not your assistant, unfortunately. Sadly, no, it will not send the email for you. I also thought the relationship angle was huge. Wanting a high-quality partner while bringing low-quality energy is not sustainable. Life will keep matching your level until you do better. That line about rising to your values and falling to your wounds hit hard. Because it is kind of fair and kind of humiliating. Brutal, but fair is basically her whole style. And then grief came in, which was maybe the quietest but deepest part. Her point was you cannot bypass grief and pretend you healed. That is uncomfortable because everyone wants a shortcut through heartbreak. But she is right because avoidance just delays the bill. I liked that she did not make healing sound glamorous. It sounded like work, patience, and a lot of emotional honesty. The aging experiment was unreal too. Those older adults literally got more mobile when they started living like they were younger. That is a stunning example of mindset shaping physiology. Which means your self-talk is not harmless background noise. It is constantly writing instructions. And the same goes for language like saying need all the time. That tiny shift from need to choose changes your sense of agency. Which is why half of adulthood is basically editing your inner script. The neuroscience of all of it is what makes this series so satisfying. Myelination, synaptic connection, neurogenesis, BDNF, all of it points to change. And the simple version is still the best version. Sleep well, move often, eat well, regulate stress, repeat the right behaviors. Then the brain starts believing the new pattern. I think that is why the closing takeaway matters so much. Be clear on what you want, visualize it, feel it, and then act like it is real. Not because fantasy is enough, but because clarity creates movement. And movement is where the actual magic lives. If there is one thing this episode leaves behind, it is responsibility without shame. You are not fixed, you are trainable. Which is both encouraging and mildly annoying because now you have to do the work. But that is the good news, honestly. Thank you for being with us for the full arc of this conversation. We hope it gave you something useful, not just something interesting. And if it changed one sentence in your inner dialogue, that is huge. That is the end of the series, and we will see you in the next one.